Boom, en direct, nous sommes en direct. Pas suffisamment de données pour assurer une diffusion fluide. Anyway, celui-là on va le YOLO. Parce que c'est ça qu'on fait aujourd'hui. Je vais peut-être venir streamer un peu plus tard aujourd'hui. Donc là, je vais faire mon premier stream. Je vais lire quelques livres. Mais ça, c'est le laptop de ma blonde qui est vraiment meilleur que le mien parce que j'ai pas besoin d'un aussi bon laptop que ça. Donc dans le fond, ben là, je vais devoir revenir aujourd'hui un peu plus tard pour tester le setup que j'ai en ce moment sur mon laptop. Parce que dans le fond, si je filmais l'écran, ça demandait trop de frame computation, ce qui faisait que sur mon ordinateur, ça laguait trop, et donc c'était pas possible de filmer avec ça. Donc, je mets une fixed image à la place, donc ça va être une fixed image de Firecamp. On va probablement en trouver une meilleure at some point. Donc voilà. C'est ça qui est ça. Donc ça va nous sauver pas mal de computation, puis on va pouvoir aller continuer ça avec l'autre laptop aujourd'hui, un peu plus tard aujourd'hui. Donc voilà, à plus. Hop là. Donc le prix chaud. Effectivement, je suis une petite puff. Comme un gros addict que je suis. Tabarnak. La cire avec tout. C'est un goût pas génial. Donc pas de chat aujourd'hui, donc si vous envoyez un message ou quoi, je le vois pas. Mais merci d'être là en tout cas, si t'es là. Donc sinon, nous on va lire 3-4 livres aujourd'hui, je pense. Peut-être plus 2 avec la durée que le stream dure en général, c'est difficile de dépasser 2. Je pense que je vais faire le même combo qu'hier probablement. Je vais lire du Joko Willing first pour me donner l'énergie de lire La Place. Je vais aller lire La Place, qui est une traduction du français en anglais. Donc elle est pas géniale la traduction honnêtement, mais bon c'est La Place, donc on va lire un peu. Il y a du gold. Du gold. La moitié fait pas de sens. 50% fait pas de sens, mais si tu prends juste les 50% qui font du sens, c'est du gold. Et ensuite on va aller lire L'Histoire de la pensée par Jacques Chevalier. Celui-là aussi c'est un rough one. On va peut-être lire un peu de Joko Willing entre les deux, mais bref. Et l'autre c'est L'Histoire d'Aristote écrit par Jacques Chevalier. Et c'est super génial, méga détaillé, avec tous les détails du monde que tu voudrais savoir sur la vie d'Aristote, sur qu'est-ce qu'il a fait, sur ses pensées, mais genre vraiment, le gars il digue profond dans les pensées, il va même voir genre d'autres personnes qui ont interprété le mec et tout, pour te linker tout vraiment genre le full-fledged outil, vraiment, qu'Aristote peut t'amener, mais genre aussi élucidé par d'autres personnes. C'est vraiment bon. Allez, c'est parti. Je pense que je peux jump right in, mais je vais dire un peu de Joko Willink pour le fun. Discipline Equals Freedom by Joko Willink. Field Manual MK1 Mod 1 Expanded Edition. And we are at page 40, I believe. Yeah, page 38. Nature versus nurture. What is more important, nature or nurture? In my opinion, neither. I have seen people from every stratum of life. In the military, I worked with every type of person. Ivy League kids with silver spoons, former gangbangers, hood rats, prep school kids, kids from blue-collar families, kids from strong families and kids with no families, kids who were pampered and kids who were abused, and everything in between, everything. And with all those different types of people, there were good and bad, successful and unsuccessful. And in working with businesses, I see the same thing. People from every walk of life, from the bottom to the top. And I have seen every type of person be successful. So to me, it is not about nature or nurture. It is about choice. The people who are successful decide they are going to be successful. They make that choice. And they make other choices. They decide to study hard. They decide to work hard. They decide to be the first person to get to work and the last to go home. They decide they are going to take on the hard jobs, take on the challenges. They decide they are going to lead when no one else will. They choose who they are going to hang around, and they choose who they will emulate. They choose to become who they want to become. They aren't inhibited by nature or nurture. They overcome both. And I will tell you something else. It is never too late to make that choice. You are never too old to decide where you are going to focus your efforts and push to make the most out of every situation. So think not about what you've been through and where you are. Think about where you are going and choose. Choose to make yourself smarter and stronger and healthier. Choose to work out and study and eat good food and keep your mind clean. Don't let nature or nurture make you. Choose to make yourself. Ouf! Ouf! Joko est dans la place, mon cher. Juste en lire un, ça donne assez de fuel pour aller lire du Laplace, je pense. Et faire au moins genre 10 burpees. Un truc de même. On était rendu à la fin de l'explication des phases de la Lune. Avec nous explique toutes les maths qu'il y a derrière prédire les éclipses. Atmosphere which may be supposed to surround the moon inflects the ray of light toward the center of this star, and if, as ought to be the case, the atmospherical strata are rarer in proportion as they are farther removed from the surface, these rays, according as they penetrate farther into it, ought to be more inflected, and should consequently describe a curve which is concave to its surface. Hence, it appears that a spectator on the surface of the moon would not cease to see the star till it was depressed below the horizon by an angle equal to the horizontal refraction. The rays which emanate from this star, seen at the horizon, after having touched the surface of the moon, continue their route, describing a curve similar to that which they described in approaching the surface. Thus, a second spectator placed behind the moon, with respect to the star, would still continue to perceive it in consequence of the inflection of its rays in the moon's atmosphere. The diameter of the moon is E, not sensibly increased by the refraction of its atmosphere. Therefore, a star appears to be eclipsed later than if this atmosphere did not exist. And for the same reason, it ceases to be eclipsed sooner, so that the effect of the atmosphere of the moon is principally apparent in the duration of the eclipses of the sun and of the stars by the moon, precisely precise and numerous observations have enabled us with difficulty to suspect its existence, and it has been ascertained that at the surface of the moon the horizontal refraction does not exceed 4 seconds. This refraction at the surface of the Earth is at least 1,000 times greater. Therefore, the lunar atmosphere, if any such exists, is of an extreme rarity, greater even than that which can be produced on the surface of the Earth by the best constructed air pumps. It may be inferred from this that no terrestrial animal could live or respire at the surface of the moon, and that, if the moon be inhabited, it must be by animals of another species. There is ground for supposing that all is solid at its surface, for it appears in our powerful telescopes as an arid mass, on which some have thought they could perceive the effects and even the explosions of volcanoes. Bouguer has found by experiment that the light of the full moon, F, is 300,000 times more feeble than that of the sun. This is the reason why this light, collected in the focus of the most powerful mirrors, produce no sensible effect on the thermometer. We may distinguish, especially near to the new moons, that part of the disk of the moon which is not illuminated by the sun. This feeble light, which has been termed the lumière cendrée, is supposed to be the effect of the light which the illuminated hemisphere of the earth reflects on the G moon, and that which confirms this supposition is the circumstance of this light being most sensible near to the new moon, when the greatest part of this hemisphere is directed towards this star. In fact, it is evident that the earth exhibits to a spectator at the moon phases similar to those which the moon presents to us, but accompanied with a much stronger light, on account of the greater extent of the earth's surface. The disk of the moon presents a great number of invariable spots, which have been carefully observed and described. They prove to us that this star always presents to us the same hemisphere. It revolves on its axis in a period equal to that of its revolution about the earth. For if a spectator be placed at the center of the moon, supposed transparent, he will perceive the earth and his visual ray to revolve about him. And as this ray traverses always the same point of the moon's surface very nearly, it is evident that this point must revolve in the same time, and in the same direction as the earth about the spectator. Nevertheless, a continued observation of the moon's disk indicates slight varieties in its appearances. Spots are observed to approach and recede alternately from its borders. Those which are very near to the borders disappears and reappears successively, making periodical oscillations, which have been denominated the libration of the moon. In order to form a precise idea of the principal causes of this phenomenon, it should be considered that the disk of the moon, as seen from the center of the earth, is terminated by the circumference of a circle of the lunar globe, which is perpendicular to its radius h vector. It is on the plane of this circle that the hemisphere of the moon, which is directed towards the earth, is projected, the appearances of which are connected with the motion of rotation of this star. If the moon had no motion of rotation, its radius vector would describe on its surface, in each lunar revolution, the circumference of a great circle, all the parts of which would be successively presented to us. But at the same time that the radians vector tends to describe this circumference, the lunar globe, by revolving, brings always very nearly the same point of its surface to this radius, and consequently the same hemisphere to the earth. The inequalities of the motion of the moon produce slight changes in its appearances. For as its motion of rotation does not participate in a sensible manner in these inequalities, it is a variable relative to its radius vector, which thus meets its surface in different points. Therefore, the lunar globe makes relatively to this radius oscillations which correspond to the inequalities of its motion, and which alternately deprive us of and exhibit to us some parts of its surface. Moreover, the lunar globe has another libration perpendicular to the preceding, in consequence of which the region I which are situated near to the poles of rotation alternately disappear and reappear. In order to conceive this phenomenon, let the axis of rotation be supposed perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic. When the moon is in the ascending node, its two poles will be in southern and northern extremities of the visible hemisphere. According to it ascends above the ecliptic, the north pole and those parts which are contiguous to it disappear, whilst more and more of those parts which border on the south pole are discovered, until the moon, having attained its greatest northern latitude, recommences to descend towards the ecliptic. The preceding phenomena then takes place in a reverse order, and after that the moon, having arrived at the descending node, is depressed below the ecliptic. The north pole will present precisely the same phenomena as the south pole had previously exhibited. The axis of rotation of the moon is not exactly perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic, and its inclination produces appearance which may be conceived by supposing the moon to move on the plane itself of the ecliptic, in such a manner that its axis of rotation remains always parallel to itself. It is manifest that then each pole will be visible during one half of the revolution of the moon about the earth, and invisible during the other half, so that those parts which are contiguous to the poles will be alternately perceived and concealed. Finally, the observer is not at the center, but at the surface of the earth. It is the visible ray drawn from his eye to the center of the moon which determines the middle of the visible hemisphere, and on account of the lunar parallax, it is evident that this radius intersects the surface of the moon in points which depends on the height of the moon above the horizon. All these causes produce only an apparent libration in the lunar globe. They are purely optical and do not affect the real motion of rotation. However, this motion may be subject to some small inequalities, though they are not sufficiently sensible to be discerned. This is not the case with the variations of the plane of the lunar equator. From an attentive observation of the spots of the moon, Dominic Cassini inferred that the axis of this equator is not exactly perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic, as had been supposed previous to his time, and not that its successive positions are not exactly parallel. This celebrated astronomer was led to the following remarkable result. One of his most splendid discoveries, and which contains the entire astronomical theory of the real libration of the moon. If through the center of this star a plane be conceived to pass perpendicular to its axis of rotation, which plane coincides with that of its equator. If, moreover, we conceive a second plane to pass through the same center parallel to that of the ecliptic, and a third plane which is the plane of the lunar orbit, abstracting from the periodic inequalities of its inclination and of the nodes, these three planes have invariably a common intersection. The second situated between the two others makes with the first an angle of about 1 degree 67, and with the third an angle of 5 degree 7155. Consequently, the intersections of the lunar equator with the ecliptic, or its nodes, coincide always with the mean nodes of the lunar orbit, and like them, they have a retrograde motion, of which the period is about 6,793 day, 391081. In this interval, the two poles of the equator and of the lunar orbit describe small circles parallel to the ecliptic, its pole being comprised between them, so that these three poles exist always on the same great circle of the celestial sphere. They are mountains on the surface of the moon, which rise to a considerable height. Their shadows projected on the plains form spots which vary with the position of the sun. At the edges of the illuminated part of the lunar disk, these mountains present the form of an intended border which extends beyond the line of light by a quantity of which the measurement proves that their height is at least 3,000 meters. From the direction of these shadows, it has been inferred that the surface of the moon is intersected by deep cavities, similar to the basins of our seas. Finally, this surface seems to show traces of volcanoes and the formation of new spots, and the sparks which are observed in its obscure part appear to indicate volcanoes in actual operation. So we are at chapter 5 of the planets, and in particular of Mercury and of Venus. Juste voir si je peux passer au travers. Ah oui, c'est easy. In the midst of the infinite number of shining points which are spread over the celestial vault, and of which the relative position is very nearly constant, 10 stars, always visible, except when they are immersed in the rays of the sun, move according to a very complicated laws, the investigation of which constitutes one of the principal objects of astronomy. These stars, which have been denominated planets, are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which have been known from the remotest antiquity, because they can be observed by the naked eye, and likewise Uranus, Ceres, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta, which have been recently discovered by means of the telescope. The two first planets never recede from the sun beyond certain limits. The others are elongated from it to all possible angular distances. The motions of all these bodies are comprehended in a zone of the celestial sphere, which is called the zodiac, the breadth of which is divided into two equal parts by the ecliptic. The elongation of Mercury from the sun never exceeds 32 degrees. When it begins to appear in the evening, it is distinguished with difficulty in the rays of twilight. It extricates itself more and more on the succeeding days, and after it is elongated from the sun about 25 degrees, it returns towards him again. In this interval, the motion of Mercury with respect to the stars is direct, but when in approaching the sun, its distance from this star is about 20 degrees. It appears stationary, and afterwards the motion becomes retrograde. Mercury still continues to approach the sun, and at length, in the evening, is again immersed in his rays. After continuing for some time invisible, it is again seen in the morning, emerging from the sun's rays and receding from him. Its motion is still retrograde, as it was previous to the disappearance, but when the planet is 20 degrees elongated from the sun, it becomes again stationary, and afterwards resumes a direct motion. Its elongation from the sun continues to increase till it becomes equal to 25 degrees, when the planet returns again, disappearing in the morning in the light of the dawn, and very soon after appearing in the evening, after which the same phenomena as before takes place. The extent of the greatest digression of Mercury, or of his greatest deviations on each side of the sun, varies from 18 to about 32 degrees. The duration of its total oscillation, m, or of its return to the same position relatively to the sun, varies in like manner from 106 to 130 days. The ocean R of retrogradation is about 15 degrees, and its mean duration is 23 days. But these quantities differ considerably in different retrogradation. In general, the motion of Mercury is extremely complicated. It does not take place exactly end of the ecliptic.